welcome Melissa Hill.
Okay.
Yay.
Yay. Okay.
Welcome.
Right. Welcome. Thank you.
How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. It feels quite unnatural to have all this around me, but I'm doing good.
Perfect. Well, I know the mic and the giant headphones can be a little intimidating sometimes, but no, it sounds great, looks great. So yeah, we'll get started with our podcast today on well-being.
Fantastic.
So the first question I have for you is just a basic definition. What is well-being?
I might not give you a basic definition, so bear with me. I think people can have a really different idea about what well-being is. And sometimes when people talk about well-being, they'll link this to mental health or speak about well-being and mental health as being interchangeable, which is not the case. And there are so many different definitions of well-being that exist. So I think it's absolutely the perfect question to start this podcast off with, because we need to know what we're talking about when we're talking about well-being. So we know what we're trying to achieve and we know where to focus our attention. So if we go right back to a really early definition of well-being, I think it was from 1946, and it was by Seligman. And he said that well-being was to do with the absence of illness. So Seligman's often cited as the founder of positive psychology. He suggested that initially psychology could focus too much on the worst of things, the negatives that we experience or our ill health, and how to fix this, rather than looking at when there is no illness, how do we create that state? What is needed for that to flourish? And it's a really interesting perspective, that shift from focusing on what needs to be fixed to what do we need to do in order to experience positive emotions? What does that state look like? So that's just one definition, the absence of illness. And then the American Psychological Association, the APA, defines well-being as a state of happiness and contentment with low levels of distress, overall good physical and mental health, and outlook or good quality of life. The World Health Organization describes well-being as a positive state experienced by individuals and societies, and similar to health, it is a resource for daily life and is determined by social, economic and environmental conditions. One final one would be from the UK. The Department of Health defines well-being as feeling good and functioning well, and comprises each individual's experiences of their life and a comparison of life circumstances with social norms and values, which is quite a mouthful, and I had to reread a couple of times myself to really try and get what it was saying. But even if we break all of these definitions down, there are still questions. So what does feeling good require or look like? What are those individual life experiences that comprise someone's well-being? What do we mean when we say a state of happiness or a good quality of life? What does that actually look like and mean? And I guess I'd pause there and ask you, I've just thrown a few different definitions out at you. What is anything standing out? Would you agree with them? Is there anything that you think's missing from those definitions?
I mean, I think I definitely hear the through line in all those definitions of generally not being sick or ill and have like physically sick or ill and having it sounds to me like having your basic needs met.
Yeah.
Like food, shelter, those sort of things. And then so it sounds like there's to me like a physical component, mental component, environmental component. Yeah, and overall to me, I guess more positive than negative if I had to think about well-being. But it's funny because in everyday language we talk about happiness. And I think a lot of times when people say like, oh, like what's the key to happiness or those sort of things, like they are actually meaning like well-being in your life or contentment if you're talking emotionally. But we kind of in colloquial language default to happiness.
Yeah. And I think that's well-being can be used to speak about so many different things, which is why I think it's important we're really clear about what we're talking about. And I think you're absolutely right. The point that I took away from those definitions is exactly what you said there. It's not just about one thing. It brings in our physical health, it brings in our emotional health, it brings in our environment, it brings in our values, our circumstances, our quality of life. So well-being is to do with so many different things. It's not just a singular or one-dimensional concept or definition. There's a lot to it. And to try and give you an answer, I'll go back to the work of Seligman, and we'll probably talk about him quite a lot throughout this conversation. His work does span decades. Martin Seligman. Yes.
Okay.
And he's often cited as that founder of positive psychology, and he's contributed a great deal to the knowledge and research around your question of what is well-being. But he developed a model called the PERMA model of well-being, so PERMA, which stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. So if I can just break them down a little bit, positive emotions is this component of well-being refers to feelings of happiness, pleasure, comfort, also feelings of hope, interest, joy, love, compassion. The E is for engagement, and this is about the extent to which we have a connection with the activity or course, and how absorbed we might be and intrinsically motivated we might be about the tasks that we're doing. The R is to do with relationships. So what relationships do we have with those around us, with our society, with our community, and with our colleagues, our peers? To what extent do we feel cared for or looked after and supported by our social network? And I find the relationship part of the PERMA model really interesting, because there's so much evidence out there that says that relationships have such an influence, not just on our well-being, but also on other positive health behaviours. So there's some research that states that the presence of positive relationships are beneficial for health behaviours such as the management of chronic illnesses, for example. So they have quite an impact on a lot of aspects of our health, basically, and how we engage with that. The M in the PERMA model.
There's one really long study, if I remember right, that's like they did it every 10 years, and I can't remember what the institution is. I think it's in the United States, one of the big universities. But I remember watching that because it was like a 50-year or something insane study where they started with people and they were asking about well-being and happiness. And the biggest thing that came out of that was relationships.
Yeah.
I know you're saying PERMA, that there's those 5, but that every time they said, like, what are the things that make people the happiest, or that lead to when people say they had like a fulfilling life or a satisfying life, and it was relationships.
Absolutely. And we'll no doubt talk about relationships and how we can build them and how we can maintain them within the workplace, but they do have such an important contributing factor to our health, not just our well-being, but our actual overall health. I think it fascinates me, the kind of concepts of well-being, concepts of relationships and the impact that they have. But yeah, just going through the PERMA model, the M is to do with meaning, and this refers to having a sense of purpose or direction in life, being connected to something bigger than yourself. And then finally, we have accomplishment, so actually the progress we make towards goals and what we accomplish, what we achieve. And what Seligman, he wasn't trying to say that the PERMA model defines well-being perfectly, that it's everything that well-being's made up of, but he was trying to say that there's no single element that defines well-being, but they each contribute it, and it provides a building blocks of well-being, but actually also recognising that there are other components involved, such as your kind of financial circumstances, your responsibilities, your health, your vitality. It's not just those 5 pillars that we've just described there. And I don't know if that's giving you a simple answer to the question of what is well-being, but what I think it's important to take away is that it's in all the research in recent years that's focused on trying to define and create well-being. It's really quite clear that well-being isn't the sole responsibility of the individual. It doesn't exist in isolation from everything else. So like we've already said, the role of relationships and other people, as well as our environment and the context in which we live, also have an impact on our well-being and a part to play.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a great definition because to me, that's something that you can take away. I mean, I know you shared a lot of definitions, but as far as PERMA, right? PER. Okay, so positive emotion, engagement,
Yeah.
relationships, motivation. No,
Meaning.
meaning and
yeah.
accomplishment.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a good one because I think that's something that anyone could use, even just if you're starting with yourself and being like, okay, what where do I stand on these different areas? What might I need to focus more on? Or what, of these, which one might be lower? Do I feel like I don't have enough of one?
And I think that's absolutely it. I think when you're in those positions where maybe you've gone through a period of prolonged stress and you're trying to take a stop, check and pause and look at how you're feeling, when you look at well-being and everything that it can involve, it can probably feel quite overwhelming to think, well, what do I look at first? What do I focus on? How do I deal with this? And actually what a model like PERMA does, it gives us those 5 pillars to say, actually, let's have a look at those 5 pillars of our well-being, but acknowledging that there are going to be other contributing factors. So it does give us a starting point to start to look at our well-being and how we can start to influence it.
The other way that I've seen, and we're talking right now about just well-being and individuals, right? Like what does it mean to an individual? What can an individual do? I've also seen that there's, I can't remember, I think it's 8 or 9 like parts of life, or quote unquote, I'm using air quotes, parts of life. But that when you're evaluating your own well-being, and this is, I've seen stuff from like, life coaching and other things, that when you're evaluating your own well-being, that you can actually divide it into these 9 parts. And I think you can Google 9 parts of life and see what it comes up. But I know that there's like work, family, romantic relationships, mental, physical, emotional. That's 6. So there's 3 more in there somewhere. But when you're looking at kind of those parts of your life, which I feel like maybe it's like another layer that you can add on to the PERMA. If you look at the PERMA definition and then you're looking at these different parts of your life, how should you divide those? Or is that a good way to divide it? Or is there anything missing there?
I would say there is one formula that I don't think there is one formula which says you need to spend X% of time on a certain area of your life. What works are how one person divides that time between work, family, romantic, physical, emotional aspects. It won't be the same for you and it won't be the same for me. So you could look at that question more from the perspective of not being about how we should divide our time, but rather what balance makes you feel fulfilled or content in all those pillars or all those areas of your life at any one present moment in time. So I think when you asked that question, I don't know if it was deliberate, I think it was quite interesting how you asked it. So the phrase, when evaluating our own well-being, it's present tense. It suggests that this is something that is live. It's just something we're doing all the time. So this evaluation of our well-being, it's an ongoing action. So when we evaluate our own well-being and we're trying to decide at that present moment whether the balance we have is working for us, whether we feel content, whether we're feeling those feelings of happiness, I think instead of thinking about how well-being is divided, I think it's like I mentioned just before, it's taking that pause and a step back, almost doing a stop check and reflecting on what may be out of balance, what might we have less of, are there areas of your life that you need to spend more or less time on, and reflecting on what may be causing stress or happiness, what impact is this then having? And then considering actually how is that making us feel? So looking at the emotions, are we experiencing those feelings associated with happiness or joy or pleasure? Or has there been an increase in the negative emotions that we're experiencing, and why might that be? So you can then start to use that information to think, what may we need to change? And I think this is where a model like PERMA is really helpful, is where you get to that point of, okay, I've recognized something's out of balance. I recognize it's making me feel like this. You can start to think, what do you want to focus on first? What may need to change? What is out of balance? What can you do to rectify this? And it could be that one part of our well-being is out of balance. We can acknowledge this, we understand why, there's a reason for it. And then the other pillars or other areas of our life can almost bolster this for a time. So we might start to lean on other aspects of our well-being. But I think this is quite key. So when if we are experiencing stress, if part of our well-being is impacted because of that, be that our work-life balance, be that the positive emotions we're experiencing, and we can acknowledge that and we understand why it's happening. When we experience that prolonged period of stress, how long can those other pillars of well-being support and bolster that area? Because actually, if that goes on for a long time, what other impact is that stress going to start to have? Can those other pillars bolster that forever? And if not, what happens when the other pillars of our lives, or other pillars of our well-being, start to be impacted as well? What wider impact does that have on our resilience? And I think it's an interesting perspective, because I've often heard that people say, "Oh, not necessarily to me, but in conversations, oh, you're so resilient. Nothing ever seems to bother you. I don't know how you manage with that." But these people absolutely can and do still experience stress, and they can definitely then still have that resilience impacted. It's not just because you've been resilient in one situation that then you're resilient and can cope with anything. It's that consistent stopping and checking, not necessarily dividing our well-being, but actually regularly taking that time to pause, reflect, being aware of what and why something is out of balance, and then what we can do to readdress this that is most important. I think that consistent evaluation, looking at what is out of balance, be it the relationships in our life or other support, that will help us mitigate that impact of stress and will help us to, I was going to say protect, but promote our resilience and well-being.
For people who may not be as familiar with the term, what exactly is resilience? I know I've heard it a lot before, and I know it's related to stress. But what is it? How would you define it?
I was going to say, again, there's so many different definitions, and I remember in a previous role trying to work on a resilience guide, and I spent most of my time just trying to define resilience. I've heard it described as almost that bounceability, that ability to bounce back and to come at something, a task, a situation, with the same kind of almost energy as before. So actually during those stressful situations, during those difficult periods, to be able to get through that situation, get through that period of stress and to bounce back, it hasn't affected you. So it's almost that wraparound of our well-being. So when something stressful happens, it's actually not impacting any of our pillars of our well-being because we've got that resilience, we can bounce back from it. And I think it is so much more than that, though. I think when
I love that visual that you just gave for people who might not be watching video. So the wraparound, Melissa made a ball shape, like a spear shape with her hands, and the resilience is kind of the outer bounceability, the outer tension, so that the pillars, you said the pillars of well-being inside the sphere are protected, and it's almost like this rubber shell, like I think of it like a tennis ball, that has the rubber coating on the outside. And so I love that visual. I just wanted to call that out.
I talk with my hands all the time as well. I can't stop
so this
it.
is why for people listening, no, it's good, it's great. So for people listening, if you want this whole video of the podcast recording will also be on YouTube to watch. So if you're listening now and you want to see us like doing all the talking with our hands, I'll try and say it out loud for the people who are listening. But the video will be on here too. But yeah, that's just it's a great visual of resilience. I had never thought of it that way.
Yeah. And I think in short, if I can give a succinct answer to at least one of your questions, no
succinct answers necessary. This is what this is for.
I think for me, it's that resilience is that wraparound around our well-being. And I think when I say we need to do a pause, we need to do a stock check and check in with our well-being. I think the reason why that is so important is to protect that wraparound support around our well-being. It's to protect our resilience and our ability to manage with life and work stresses, because I think it's so easy if one part of our well-being starts to get a little bit impacted, and if we're not paying attention to it and it carries on, and then another part, that we can get to the point where we've lost some of that protection, and things within work and out of work can start to have a real impact on our health.
Yeah, that makes sense. As far as especially what you said before of it affecting like your physical health. Like if you are under stress for long enough, like there's definitely physical signs that you see that affect you. So I'm going back and forth because I want to ask about the psychology part of well-being, but I also want to ask about specifically the MBTI and personality part of well-being. But I guess the MBTI personality part falls under the psychology part. Okay. So that's my next question I have for you is what when it comes to psychology and what that has to do with well-being, and where kind of psychologists or people who study psychology might have insights into well-being. And then specifically, my second question is obviously MBTI personality type and well-being.
I feel like this should be a really easy question to ask. So what does psychology...
Well, it's easy to ask. I don't know if it's easy to answer.
I was going to say, I feel like it should be a really easy question to answer. It's kind of making me think a little bit about some of the conversations I've had with friends over the years. So as each of myself and my friends have progressed in our careers, some of them have gone on to pursue promotions or leadership roles. I pursue my professional chartership, so I'm a chartered occupational psychologist. And they've often asked for my thoughts on different situations or conversations they need to have with individuals that they lead or teams that they lead around well-being, around reasonable adjustments in the workplace, around return to work support that might be needed. And sometimes they've been really blunt, because there's nothing like your friends to ask you a really direct question. They're like, what do you actually do? What is your job? What do you do day to day? And they ask me this in that kind of tone. So I think if we look at that question from the perspective of actually, if there was a CEO of a company who is looking for a well-being lead or looking to improve well-being, and why should they look to a psychologist to undertake that role? So what can psychologists offer employers in terms of well-being? And I think to answer your question, I'd probably say psychology is so varied, it's so wide-ranging. I think that's one of the things that really attracted the degree to me many years ago when I was 18, looking at what I was going to do at university. I find psychology fascinating because it is so wide-ranging and varied, and it's study the human mind and our behaviour. And psychology can look at how we process information and make decisions and what can influence this. And psychology looks at ways in which the environment and different messaging strategies can influence our subconscious, and how likely that is then to influence whether we engage in positive behaviours or not. And I think it's that real multifaceted outlook and reach. For another visual, I almost see it as like a spider reaching its legs out, that makes psychology absolutely essential to that discussion of well-being. And I think if we take an example that looks at the workplace, so in the UK, traditionally, if someone's experiencing ill health in work, be that physical, emotional, and mental health, they would be referred to something called occupational health, where they have an assessment by a doctor or a nurse and be provided with a set of recommendations outlining the workplace support that's needed. I don't believe occupational health exists in the same way in the US, but you may be referred to your primary care physician, or if your company does have an employee assistance program, you'd be able to access that support or adjustments from there. But traditionally, and it might be the same with yourselves in the US, traditionally occupational health or other services tends to follow that medical model. They looked at your symptoms, what physical and environmental support can be provided, such as medication or an ergonomic assessment, a functional capacity evaluation, potentially changes to duties or working patterns. And these adjustments are absolutely needed. I'm not trying to take away from this approach at all. The point I'm trying to make is in the field of well-being, psychology is able to provide that holistic insight. It's able to pull together all those approaches and consider all the different aspects of the environment, the individual, their support network. And I think it's psychology or psychologists provide that depth of insight. They look under the surface of what is happening, what is the root cause of a concern, and then they work with individuals or groups to really identify the long-term solutions that are needed. And I don't think psychology has to be the only voice in this conversation. I think it's ideally placed to be part of that discussion because of the kind of breadth and depth of insights that we draw upon. So it is by no means the only voice, but psychology should definitely have a voice in that conversation.
Yeah. And then what about personality type in psychology? Obviously specifically since we are the Myers-Briggs Company Podcast, I'm curious. I know that there are lots of other there's lots of personality assessments. I know we publish a few of them, but there are many out there. But when it comes to kind of Jungian MBTI personality type, I know that MBTI and stress, that because we've done lots of things over the years about stress and type, that there's certain things that might stress me out as someone who prefers INFJ, versus something that might stress you. And I don't think I asked your MBTI type either.
I'm an INFP.
Oh, okay. So we are close.
Yeah, we're quite close. Just one letter.
Yeah. But yeah, what does, if anything, personality type have to do with someone's individual well-being?
It's a really fascinating question because it's so common, and this will probably resonate with a lot of people who either work with MBTI questionnaires as independent practitioners or work with other personality assessments that are available. It's really common when we're working with clients then to ask us, are some profiles better? Are there happier profiles or more resilient profiles than other types? And it doesn't matter how much we can explain the concept of type theory or what we mean by preference, there's still this idea that there must be a better type to be, especially when we're talking about resilience or stress. There must be a better type to be, or a better type that can cope under periods of stress. And there's some research that's been conducted by researchers of the Myers-Briggs Company, and they conducted this research across 2016 to 18, so a 3-year period. It was published in 2019, and they looked at the link between MBTI type and well-being, and specifically in terms of the most effective activities or support that would have the most positive impact on a person's well-being. So in this research, participants completed a survey which was aligned with, I'm going to take a step out of my explanation. There's a model that the Myers-Briggs Company used that's not dissimilar to PERMA, but it's called the Preman model. And the Preman model was born out of this research. So I'll explain at the end what Preman means, but it's not dissimilar to PERMA that we've just discussed. So in this research, participants completed a survey that was aligned to the Preman model, so looking at the pillars of well-being, and they also completed the MBTI Step 1 questionnaire. So the researchers were able to look at a participant's type, so their MBTI type, their scores along Preman, and then the overall scores for well-being. And they were able to find some really interesting information or findings that do suggest that our personality or our personality type does have an influence on our well-being and the type of support we're most likely to engage with, or how we're likely to engage with support. So one of the kind of key findings was that overall scores of well-being tended to be lower in people with a preference for introversion. So people with a preference for introversion also reported a slightly higher frequency of negative emotions compared to people with a preference for extroversion. And that concept around negative emotions, what is unique to the Preman model, so it's what the N stands for in Preman, it's negative emotions, because what this research identified was that it's the absence of or the reduction of negative emotions is also important for our well-being. So this research found that people with a preference for introversion reported a slightly higher frequency of experiencing negative emotions compared to people with a preference for extroversion. They also it is fascinating. They also identified that the lowest overall score of well-being related to people with an ISTP type, with the highest well-being score being for an ENFP type. There's quite a slight difference if you look at the statistics in it. It's quite a slight difference, but it's important to think that actually an ISTP and an ENFP differ on 3 preferences. So extroversion, introversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, which really does suggest that our personality has an influence on our well-being, or how we're experiencing well-being, what well-being looks like for us. And I think as I was looking through the research a while back, what the research couldn't identify, which I think will be a really interesting next step to explore, is why those people with a preference for extroversion were reporting higher levels of well-being. And it may be that the work environments more readily reflect extroversion preferences, so they have their preferences met more frequently, or that those with a preference for extroversion are more likely to report positive well-being through the likelihood that they might interact more with discussions and engage with others. So when we're talking earlier about relationships having such a key importance, how likely are people with a preference for extroversion to engage in that part and therefore report higher levels of overall well-being? So I think there's some fascinating.
I was just going to say my instant thought. No, it's fine. My instant thought when you said that people who prefer extroversion reported slightly lower on well-being just in general, my thought was like, oh, well, that's because not everyone who prefers introversion gets to work from home like some of us do. And my automatic was, well, most introverts would, I assume, probably be most people who prefer introversion might be a lot happier if they got to work from home, because they get to control the amount of interaction that they have versus the amount of like alone time in their head they have. And I know personally, as someone who works from home, like I get a good amount of quiet time, and that's and that's great for me. I really appreciate that. I know there's probably lots of factors that go into it, but I could see being that's just the first one that popped into my head.
So that those people who have that preference for extroversion, so like I said, people that preference for introversion reporting a slightly higher frequency of negative emotions compared to people with preference for extroversion. It is just really interesting when you think, why is it that those people with preference for extroversion are reporting those higher scores on well-being? What is it about the environment? And I think the working from home is a really interesting one, especially, I don't know what it's like in the US, but there's definitely a move in the UK of coming back into the office, of employers wanting people to come back into the office, and the discussion around
here too.
I was going to say I'd be surprised if it wasn't. So it'll be really fascinating to think actually what influence has being able to work from home had on the well-being of people with preference for introversion. And like you said, being able to control and have essentially control over those interactions that they may not have had before. I think it'll be a really interesting step to explore why those people with preference for extroversion are reporting those higher levels of well-being. And over the next few years, as potentially we do move back to office-based working, what impact does that have?
Yeah. When it makes me think of too the Susan Cain book. I can't remember if it's called The Power of Introverts, but I know it's called Quiet, and the subtitle is the power of, I think it's Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. But just that generally, like you said, are a lot of business. Oh yeah, I know, it's good. A lot of businesses and things are, and a lot of cultures too. I know, well, especially a lot of Western cultures definitely veer towards extroversion being the preferred method of interaction, I guess, or the preferred, I'm going to say preferred preference, but the preference that's more dominant and more valued generally. But yeah, I wonder So yeah, that makes me want to go back and say, okay, well, wait, but if we looked at the countries where like maybe culturally introversion is a lot more accepted and valued, I wonder if that would still, and I know this study was global, right?
I think it was across about 10,000 people in 131 countries. So it is a global sample.
That's a good amount of countries.
Yeah, definitely. But it's just as we were talking, I was thinking then it was done across 2016, 17, 18. So obviously pre-COVID.
Right before COVID. Mm-hmm.
The way we work has changed a significant amount. So it would be interesting to see what the impact of COVID has had, of returning to the office may have. Definitely.
Yeah. We'll see if we get if we get any comments that say, hey, we want that follow-up research.
Yeah.
We'll go bug our research team and say, hey, so we did this podcast and we have this great idea. We need this follow-up study.
Over to you.
Back to you.
There's so many other things. If we've got time, there's a couple of other findings that I thought were quite interesting to your question.
Yeah, I'd love to hear them.
So it's a little bit hard to explain them without just really quickly explaining what PREMAN was. So PREMAN stands for positive emotions, relationships, engagement, meaning, accomplishment, and negative emotions. So it's that N, that negative emotions, that makes this model quite unique, because this research did identify that the reduction in or the absence of experiences of distress, of negative emotions, is part of our well-being. So part of the research, I was going to say it makes sense. Part of the research was participants were asked to rank order the 6 variables of the PREMAN model in order of the impact it had on well-being. So like I said, in PREMAN model, the relationship part refers to mutual feelings of caring, support and satisfaction. So to what extent do we have those meaningful relationships with those around us that contain mutual feelings of care, support, satisfaction? And it was this aspect of well-being, relationships, that was found to be the highest rated factor for well-being across all types apart from 3. So it has such a big impact on our well-being, the kind of relationship part of our well-being. And I mentioned that apart from an INTJ, an ESTJ, and an ENTJ. So an INTJ rated accomplishment as the highest factor, whereas an ESTJ and an ENTJ rated meaning as the highest factor contributing to their workplace well-being. So generally relationships, but there was a couple of differences between the types in terms of accomplishing meaning also being really important. And I think in terms of...
So as someone who doesn't do research frequently, that's so interesting to think that, like, okay, across 10,000 people in 130 countries, that there are similarities between type of rating these 6 things, and these 3 types did not rate relationship, like they related relationship second, but accomplishment and meaning. That's fascinating.
I was going to say relationships are still up there. It's still a really important part of the well-being, but it's just that for those types, accomplishment and meaning actually had more of an impact on their well-being, or are rated as being more important than relationships.
Which I feel like would be really important to know if you know your MBTI type and you're trying to, increase your own well-being or your happiness generally. We know now well-being is the bigger overarching one, and happiness is a little part of the well-being. But yeah, I feel like knowing that would kind of make a big difference.
And I think it's, if you look at it in terms of what this research would suggest that employers could do with this kind of information, because I know we talk about the individual, and knowing this information is absolutely really important, because actually if you're an INTJ and actually accomplishment meant something to you, and actually if you're in the workplace, you may well really benefit from looking at, okay, what are the goals that I want to work towards? What do I need to do in order to achieve them? So that kind of achievement of the goals is going to be really important for you. And actually, if there's barriers in the way, what can you do to remove those barriers, to address those barriers, so you can achieve that accomplishment? And so it is really important for the individual to understand. But I think also from the perspective of an employer, they would really benefit from taking the time to consider how they can build meaningful relationships or create a culture that would enable this, but also how can they create opportunities for meaning and accomplishment. So taking those steps, the first step of actually understanding the needs of interests of an employee, looking at the roles and trying to align them to what those needs and interests are, or creating that flexibility where an employee can shape their own role and engage with work that aligns to things that they find important and things that they want to accomplish. And I know that's easier said than done. Some workplaces may have a really rigid way of doing something. I don't like the word rigid. They might have a very specific way of doing something, or they might be mandated to do something in a certain way. And it means that there might be less flexibility there to enable an employee to engage in work, or only engage in work that's going to meet their interests or give them meaning or accomplishment. But I also think this kind of information is really helpful to an employer, or to line managers even, to start to think, actually, how can we shape some of these roles that meets what that person's going to need in terms of their personality and in terms of how that will influence their well-being. Does that make sense? I feel like I may have gone off on a bit of a tangent there.
No. It makes sense, and it's interesting because the going back and forth between the like well-being individual, but then individuals, most people spend so much of their time, their life at work, that it makes sense that the well-being part at work would be a huge part of your overall well-being.
Absolutely.
Just because of the amount of time that you spend at work. So I have more questions about work.
Good for it.
But before we move on to kind of well-being at work, just one last question, which is, if you could give someone like one piece of advice, one takeaway for individuals, right? Not managers or work, but just individuals on how can people increase their well-being, what would that be?
I'm pausing because I don't know how to do it in one piece of advice.
Okay, it could be two or three.
Okay. In all seriousness, there are so many ways this question can be answered, so I will try and be really specific here. I think my one piece of advice, or my first piece of advice, would be really to be conscious about taking that pause and to stop check. And whether you use the pre-man model or a different approach, but actually consciously stopping, pausing, and checking in with the different parts of your well-being, really taking that time to recognize when something might be out of balance and acknowledging what might be causing that and what we can do. How's that making you feel, and what can you do to rectify that and to address it? I think through that regular check-in that regular check-in with our well-being is when we're going to be able to identify actually when something needs to be done, because actually we can all work under stressful conditions and manage relatively well with that. But unless we're doing that constant check-in, unless we're quite consistent in looking at our well-being and reflecting and seeing if things are still in balance or if they're working for us, it's quite easy for that stress to get prolonged. And it can be quite quick for it to start to really impact our well-being. And then our well-being starts to be impacted. And we talked about that kind of visual of the globe, that kind of the resilience, that protective piece around our well-being. And if we're not checking in, that little bit of stress builds and builds and builds, and it starts to impact that kind of protective sphere around our well-being. It's probably my one piece of advice answer. There's other things I can say if you want me to go on to that.
How often is regular? How often should we be doing regular checks? Because I know for me, I am a person who is go all the time, very type A, like very trying to do all the things because I'm interested in so many things. But I usually only stop and do the check when like I'm really stressed because I realize something's really wrong, but I probably don't. So what is a good like regular cadence for people, or what could we start with?
I would be hesitant to put a number on it because again, it goes back to everyone's going to be different. Personally, I'll tend to do it daily, and sometimes it's a really quick thing of, at the end of the day, I will think, okay, how's that day gone? What have I got on tomorrow? And I'm almost asking myself, when I say, what have I got on tomorrow? I'm thinking, have I got the resources in me to deal with what's coming to tomorrow? Have I got the resilience to deal with that? Have I, is there anybody I need to speak to, like in terms of relationships? I think for me, sometimes I do it daily, and it's not something that I have to physically stop and spend a great deal of time on. But it's almost that kind of internal conversation with yourself to say, actually, where am I? And sometimes I'm doing it daily, quite quick, and sometimes you can have a longer period of time, and you may stop and take a longer time to reflect. And I just think, if there's anyone listening to this that thinks, oh, I never do that, or like you've just said, I let it get to the point where I know something's wrong, it's almost about doing it really consciously or at the start, and doing it maybe daily to get yourself used to thinking about how you're feeling, what might be out of balance, what impact is that having. And like a lot of things, the more you're doing that, the more it becomes part of your day-to-day kind of question to yourself, and the more aware of your well-being and when it's being impacted you'll become. If that answers the question.
Do it before it starts to feel really
essentially that.
Yeah.
So if there's I think if there's anyone listening, that is my one piece of advice around how to kind of support your own. If you're aware that you let things get to a point where you're either exhausted, it breaks my heart when people I've spoken to in the past have said, I've cried at work today because of the workload, because of conflict with a colleague or a manager. No one should be crying at work. And I know it does happen. And I just think how we need to get to the point before that happens. We need to be trying to be not letting us, basically, we're not getting to the point where we're crying at work, because actually we've let that little bit of stress, like I said earlier, creep up and creep in and start to have a real impact.
Yeah. That's great. I love that piece of advice. I'm going to start thinking, like, even if it's just a minute before I go to sleep, I will check in and think, okay, how are you doing today?
I think
how was today? What's coming tomorrow?
And I think it's just so interesting, because again, looking at it from the employer perspective, an employer can make a change that to them seems really quite simple. It can be a change in shift pattern. It can be a change in office location that you're working from. And they may not envisage the impact. Well, they might consider the impact in people in terms of, if you're working a day shift and then you go to night shift, or, if you work in a different office location, they might think, actually, how much longer is it going to take for the workforce to travel? What are the costs involved in that? But actually, what is the impact on us? So there was a colleague I worked with previously that explained this perfectly, that actually you might be on a day shift and you might be doing a really difficult job, a high volume of demand, real high scrutiny and criticality, and you might have an amazing network of people on your shift that actually really plays into that relationship part of our well-being that we were talking about. And then for whatever reason, it could be you've got a childcare demand or a caring commitment. It could be that your employer makes a slight change and suddenly you go onto a night shift. Initially, I would probably think nothing more of like, oh, that's going to be quite difficult to get into the pattern of sleeping, or how much sleep I'm actually realistically going to get in the day. And if we don't stop and do a stop check, what we don't realise is that relationship part of our well-being that was really solid has changed quite a bit, because who's on that night shift? Do we know them as well? Do we feel as comfortable talking to them about things that are going on as the people that we might have been on the day shift with? And actually, if they're not, and the people that are on the day shift, your patterns are now out of sync. So it actually makes it a little bit more difficult for us to step into the relationships that we may have had before. And before we know it, our relationship part of our well-being is by an innocuous change in shift patterns or working location has actually started to have quite an impact on one part of our well-being. Because it's not to say people who work on day shifts and night shifts don't interact, but that interaction becomes harder. I've got a really good friend that works night shifts, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of conversation to really maintain our friendship, because we just actually, our lives going like ships passing, I think is the phrase I'm looking for.
Yeah.
So it's that point that actually there can be a really small change, a really small bit of stress, something that happens. If we're not checking in and being aware of how that's actually impacting, it can start to have quite an impact. I'm using my hands again, and I don't.
Yeah. That's such a great example. I never thought of, because things at work change all the time. I feel like change for a lot of people is a normal part of just being at work, and it could be something that's so small that a manager or someone thinks, oh, well, just, I'll just put this person on night shift for a couple weeks and it'll be fine, and then they can go back, but not thinking about the repercussions of how that might affect well-being at work. So let's get into I know we've been going for a while, but I do want to get into the well-being at work conversation, because I know that there's a lot here too. So I know that, us as individuals, we can do so much to increase our own well-being, but like we know, we spend a lot of time at work. I think it's like a third of our life when you come to, it's like a third of the life is at work, a third of the life is sleeping, and then the rest is, weekends. But when it comes to what companies can do, what are the things that a company could do from their side to increase an employee's well-being at work?
Okay. So I'm gonna give an answer, but I think there might be more bits that we can talk about. So I'll give my first answer. Companies will have all different resources. So there's employee assistance programs, or EAPs, and they can include things like access to remote or in-person therapy, telephone support, online resources, guidance, meditation, access to different health apps. But some companies will take this further and build a wellbeing culture throughout their organisation. And this can be done by embedding it into an onboarding process or even the recruitment processes. It can be about providing line managers with specific training, embedding skills. I'm going to hesitate here because I don't know if it's a UK or an international. So there's mental health first aid, or mental health first aiders, where people are qualified and having those conversations around not just mental health but around well-being. So that becomes part of a mandatory training, so people can at least have a conversation. And I think it's a little bit like what I said before. It's also about employees thinking, how do we create opportunities for meaningful relationships to develop? So if we're saying relationships are having across MBTI type, apart from the three I mentioned, it's having the most impact on well-being, how do employers create the opportunities for that? And there's also some outcomes from the research that the Myers-Briggs Company did that said, actually, for employees to have autonomy in their role, to be able to shape their role as well. So actually, how do employers create that autonomy? So there was a really interesting paper that I read a little while ago that was published by Deloitte, and it was based in 2022. And I'm just looking at the corner of my screen thinking, oh, that's actually 2 years ago already. That's ridiculous.
Doesn't feel like it.
It really doesn't feel like it. So they released a paper called Mental Health and Employers and the Case for Investment, and it had some really interesting information that looked at the return of investment by type of intervention. So how this information, or how I feel this information can be used, it starts to indicate what kind of support employers could really try and focus their attention to if they're wanting to have a real impact on employees' well-being. So not I don't know if the phrase sticking plaster translates. So you just don't want to put a little plaster over an issue.
Plaster?
So it's a phrase of, if you just, a tick box exercise, does that translate?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so the sticking plaster is if you just want to put a little plaster over an issue, and it's not really going to do anything, but it'll hold it in place for a time being.
This is like Band. Oh, what is it? It's the Taylor Swift. Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes.
Yes, yes,
There you go.
perfect.
Got my Taylor Swift reference in there.
Love it. So the Deloitte findings can really start. Employers could really start to use it to think, actually, if we want to have a real impact on well-being, this is what we could be doing. So some of the specific findings that I found really interesting, apologies, I'm going to quote some numbers and they are in pounds, but I think the point should translate. So organisation-wide early interventions such as cultural change programs, raising awareness around well-being and mental health has the greatest return of investment of £5.60 for every £1 spent. And then there's
wow.
Yeah, so it's the highest one. Those organisation-wide.
So for every £1 spent, £1 sterling.
Yeah.
The return is 5.6.
Yeah, £5.60.
It's like a 500% ROI. All right, is my math right? That's a lot.
I was going to say, so it's maths is not my strong point. So it has a return of investment of £5.60 for every £1 spent. So proactive interventions that are introduced at an early stage has a return of investment of a little bit less, so £5 for every £1 spent. And then our reactive interventions, so those interventions that are only introduced once an employee's health has started to deteriorate. So now we are stepping into that space of talking about mental health. So when somebody has experienced stress and they may have reported it to their manager and reported it again, and that stress becomes prolonged, and actually they start to impact their mental health and that employee's health has begun to deteriorate, those reactive interventions has the lowest return of investment of £3.40 for every £1 spent. So it does suggest that the more employers do proactively upfront to support wellbeing, the most likely impact it's going to have. So those reactive interventions when someone's wellbeing isn't being supported and mental health does begin to arise have the least impact and return on investment. And it's interesting, again, apologies, I'm going to reference the CIPD, which is the Chartered Institute for Personnel Development. It's a professional body in the UK and they do some fantastic research and provide guidance to HR professionals. Absolutely worth a look on their website. They have some really, really interesting research around wellbeing. And they also release
CIPD.UK?
Yes, so it stands for Chartered Institute for Personnel Development, but yes, CIP.UK. They did some research which was published in 2022, and it again is based in the UK, but it was across 804 organisations, I think. And they were looking at what are organisations actually doing with regards to wellbeing, and they found that 51% of organisations are taking that strategic approach. So trying to embed that proactive organisation-wide approach that is likely to have the most impact. And so there's, in a really negative way, I'd argue that's only half of employees that are doing it. What are the other half doing? Are the other half only doing the reactive? Let's take the positive. Half of those organisations.
I feel like the reactive is kind of the default of what companies normally do.
And I think that's it. It isn't necessarily all about the return on investment, about what employees can get back. But organisations, which I'm sure it translates to the US, they're always being tasked to do more with less. We want you to do this, but you've got less resource. Or this resource is being cut, but we want you to do everything plus more. So resources can be fairly scarce. And sometimes if you've got that finite limited resources, I think this kind of information employees can start to use to, if we've only got a bit of resource, how can we use it that has the most meaningful, most wide-reaching impact on employees' well-being? And I think the point from going back to the Deloitte report that stood out for me was that they recommended that employers should be taking what they called a portfolio approach to supporting wellbeing. That everyone's going to need something slightly different. And we discussed it earlier that depending on someone's extroversion or introversion preference, they may engage with support in a different way that might look a bit different for them. Or they may rate something that builds a relationship greater or more important than engaging in a task that brings them meaning or accomplishment, which adds that concept of having that portfolio approach. So not just one approach that targets everything, but really looking strategically, how can we address well-being? What are all the things that we might need to consider as an employer? I think. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Perfect.
but it's good. It's a lot to think about, but it's also, I don't want to say it's disheartening, but when I think about personally in the 20 some years I've been in the workforce, I think there's only this company that I'm at right now that I've actually seen any sort of proactive well-being program. And I know it's I assume that it's become more common in recent years than in previous years, but those numbers are pretty astounding when it comes to just the return for proactive versus reactive, and where you could invest. I also did look up, by the way, it's cipd.org
.uk
is the website, in case anyone wants to go check it out.
I'm just trying to find the name of the Deloitte paper. It's Deloitte Mental Health and Employers, The Case for Investment, March 2022. It's got some really interesting return on investment information. They've also got information around the type of intervention and the different ways in which you can target different areas of the workforce, for example. So again, I think that would be a fascinating paper to read as well.
Yeah, well, I'll make sure to link the CIPD website, the Deloitte report, and the Myers-Briggs Wellbeing.
Yes, definitely.
Report, if it's YouTube, it's in the comments. If you're listening to it in audio, I'll put it in the show notes. But yeah, so such good information. So what was there anything in? I know you mentioned the Deloitte report and CIPD. Was there anything when it came to MBTI type at work that research said, the Myers-Briggs Company research said about well-being at work?
Yes, so I think, so if we looked a little bit there around extroversion, introversion. The research did identify outcomes that looked at patterns between effectiveness of the different strategies and MBTI type. So we know that personality can influence how we may respond to or experience well-being, but what impact does that have on the strategies you engage in as individuals? So what the research was able to identify was that there were similarities again across types, but the differences related to what could be expected or what we would expect of opposite types. For example, those with preference for extroversion rated activities that involved others as being effective for their well-being, whereas those people with preference for introversion tend to engage in activities that may not involve other people. So actually the activities themselves were relatively similar across type, but how people were likely to engage with them or who they might do that with could be quite different. And which it kind of makes sense when we look at the kind of key characteristics of extroversion, introversion, or any of the preferences really. But they did also identify some findings around age, occupation, and gender as well. So the findings suggested that there were differences in the level of well-being between occupational groups and age, in that well-being scores tended to increase with age. So if we look specifically at the kind of age categories, the youngest age group in the Myers-Briggs Company research was 18 to 24 years old, and they reported the lowest levels of well-being. The oldest age group of 65 plus reporting the highest levels of well-being. And then when we looked at occupational groups, the results suggest that occupations that experience the highest levels of well-being were education, and training, library occupations, healthcare practitioner, and technical occupations, and community and social services. Whereas those occupational categories that tend to experience the lowest levels of well-being were personal care and personal service, production occupations, and food preparation, food services. And I think it's really important that it kind of suggests that it's not only our personality that influences our well-being, but it goes back to exactly what we said at the start about how well-being involves so many different things and is so encompassing. Yeah. It's also the role that we're doing, it's the environment, the kind of tasks that we undertake also have a play on our well-being. And in terms of gender, the results, I found this really interesting actually. The results found that men and women tend to have similar levels of overall well-being, but they reported different levels of well-being across the pillars of pre-man. So women reported slightly higher levels of engagement and positive emotions compared to men. That suggests that in the workplace, women's well-being may be most supported or most impacted by emotions that link with the level of interest and enjoyment they experience from their work. Whereas in comparison, men tend to experience positive emotions less frequently than women, and they have lower levels of engagement, meaning, and accomplishment. And it would suggest that employers would benefit from looking at ways of addressing some of those factors. So what is inhibiting men's experience of positive emotions in the workplace? What can we do to encourage engagement, meaning, and accomplishment? And how can employers support that link with the level of interest and enjoyment that people experience? So there's quite a lot in terms of kind of strategies people might want to engage in and the kind of initiatives that might be effective. It's a really interesting piece of research to read through.
Yeah. One, it sounds like there's also just a lot of different I know cross-hatching isn't the word, and now I can't think of what the word is. Cross-sections. There's a lot of different cross-sections that you can look at of what, as far as you were saying, like occupational type. I'm sure I'll bet occupational level is in there. Gender, and then also MBTI type. Yeah, I'm definitely linking that in there. So when it comes to like, what advice do you have for, I feel like now that you've given me all this information, I feel like the question I have, I'm like, wait, I need to break this into 3 different questions. Because what I wanted to ask was what advice do you have for workplaces looking to better well-being? But now I feel like I need to ask that question in workplaces, like what advice do you have for workplaces? And then what advice do you have for like HR or the, people in the people development hiring HR space for well-being, and then line managers too, because we've covered individual, but I feel like now we have like those 3 different levels. And I know that that's a lot. So we'll start with the highest level. What advice do you have for like companies, like company leaders, say CEO? We'll do CEO level, and then I'll ask the other 2.
Okay. I think employees or workplaces need to consider opportunities for how they can build relationships, or how relationships can be built, how they can create a culture where spending time building relationships and valuing the relationships we have at work. What does that culture look like? And I think it's how you build it in from the start of an employee's kind of career with an organization. So it's how, for a CEO, how do you develop that strategic perspective? What opportunities are there for wellbeing to embed from the start of that employee's career would be my piece of advice for your CEO. So if you're looking at that, so if somebody joins your company, what's your recruitment advert saying? What are you recruiting for? What's your competencies or values or strengths that you're recruiting for? And actually that goes for promotions as well. So what are you valuing in terms of the leaders that you're promoting throughout the company? Because that can start to send a message in terms of I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, and I'm sure this will resonate with people who are listening, that sometimes people are promoted because they're actually technically really good at their job, but they may not have those people skills that are needed to actually then lead and manage people and have those sometimes quite difficult conversations with people around their well-being and around their behaviour. So I think from a CEO perspective, it's that strategic approach of how do you build in and create those opportunities, but how do you give your workforce and your managers the skills with which to then deliver that? Because some people might find it really easy to have that conversation, or it might come quite naturally, but it can be quite hard for some people as well. And I think,
and those are skills then that people can learn. Like you could, if I'm a manager who, you know, has great technical prowess, but maybe not the best at like checking in on my employees and their well-being, like being able to have those conversations or know what to ask, what to look for, those sort of things are skills that are learnable, right? They're trainable.
And I think it's, if we look at line managers then, or employees in general, so employees would benefit from taking that time to get to know their employees. So what are their interests and needs? What learning and development do they want to engage in? So both the employer and the employee can understand how they can be aligned to the role that the employee goes on to do. So really creating that opportunity for meaning and engagement to develop. And I think it's quite a hard statistic, and it came out of the CIPD research, that for the majority of organisations they surveyed, it was the responsibility of the line manager to have these kinds of conversations. However, at the same time, only 38% of the organisations that participated in the survey agreed that line managers were confident to have sensitive discussions or to signpost people. And actually in the UK,
38%?
In the UK,
less than half.
Yeah. So it's quite I don't want to end a podcast on that kind of note, but in the UK, management style remains amongst one of the most common causes of stress at work. And I think we ask a lot of our line managers, and they're tasked with doing a lot. And actually, you may have been promoted through no fault of your own without any of that support, without any of that development and learning of those skills that you need in order to lead people. And I think that is a piece of advice I'd give to a CEO. It'd be a piece of advice I'd give to learning and development professionals, that actually we need to look at what skills you're embedding from your very first line leader right up to senior manager to promote wellbeing and to have conversations. And I think that can be part of a recruitment process, an onboarding process. It can be part of a leadership development program. We could be assessing for those skills as part of a promotion or a selection process. So I think when we say employers need to take time to understand the needs and interests of their employees, absolutely agree with that. But who is responsible for doing that? And do they have the skills to have these conversations and then be able to do something meaningful with that information too? Because you might be great at having that conversation, but then do you know how to put that into place?
Yeah. And that makes me think of too and I don't remember exactly what it is, but I know the statistics of why, when they do exit interviews, of why people are most likely to leave positions. Every time not every time, the majority of the time, it's people's relationships with their managers. And what the common phrase, I don't know if you've heard it before, I know it's common in the US, is that people don't leave jobs, people leave managers.
Yeah, I've had that one, definitely.
Yeah. And now when you're saying this, I'm thinking, oh, like that makes sense then. And you know, the whole reason we're talking about this and talking about what workplaces can do, and or CEOs, HR, line managers, is because you want to keep the people at work that are good. Like you don't want your employees leaving. Like, that's hard for HR, it's hard for the organization. It's not, not a great look for the company, but also it makes things a lot more difficult. And then replacing employees costs a lot more.
Huge cost.
Keeping them on. Yeah, I think it's I think the stats I saw anywhere between, and obviously it varies if you're replacing like someone who's on the production floor versus someone who's a CEO, but anywhere between 120% to like 500% of that employee's salary to
Wow.
find a replacement for them. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Did not.
I know that's the one. I know because we put it in an infographic before. But yeah, most of the time it costs more to replace the employee than it does, for them to stay and just pay them their salary, just because of the turnover, the negative effect on the people that they're working with, and especially with what you're saying with relationships. I feel like then if even that daytime to nighttime shift that you were talking about, if one person leaves on a team and that person had a lot of really close relationships, I'm thinking about, oh man, like the negative emotions that are then going to affect the rest of the people on the team, and not just like them picking up the other person's work and that sort of thing. So
and again, it goes back to what we said, it's having that regular check-in with your own well-being and whether something's in balance in that moment and if it's working for you. Because absolutely, if one person leaves, you might initially think, oh, that means an extra workload. When are we going to do a handover? When's the new person starting? But actually, it could be the relationship part of your well-being that you might not necessarily think to check in on first, but it actually has, like, as we discussed, quite a significant impact on our well-being.
Yeah. Oh, this has been great. There's so much good information in here. I want to go back and listen to it now. Anything else that I haven't asked that you want to include or that we didn't get to cover before we wrap up?
Just trying to have a think, actually. I don't think so. I think there's a lot that employers can do, and there's a lot that employees can do. So do you think it's an individual can do things as well in terms of looking at their well-being, doing that check-in? The Myers-Briggs Company research did identify, I'm just trying to think what else. They had a look. So the Myers-Briggs Company research did ask participants to rate activities in terms of effectiveness, and they had some common themes about in work from an individual perspective, about having autonomy in their role, engaging in work that was of interest to them, having the opportunity to learn and be challenged. That was very much what individuals can do in work to support their well-being. But the research also looked at actually what they can do out of work. So they identified a number of out of work activities that were rated as effective. So such as spending time with friends and family, listening to or playing music, reading, focusing on the positives, exercising, playing sports. What was really interesting was that the research was able to identify that the most effective way an individual can manage their well-being related to those positive experiences they had with friends and family. So again, highlighting that role of relationships in the management of our well-being as well. So there's absolutely things that an employer can do. But there was also some research findings around actually what would be effective for individuals to do.
And what I heard when you said that was what individuals can do is play music, dance party, exercise in the kitchen with your family. That's what I got out of that. Okay. Doing that tonight. Put on some music in the kitchen, exercise, music, exercises, the dance, music, relationships, family. There we go. Dance party before you have dinner.
And I would absolutely recommend looking at the Myers-Briggs Company research when you've linked it, because there's a couple of pages that actually break down the strategies that have been found as effective for individuals by type. And there's a lot of similarities, which is why I thought it's not going to be very interesting if I just start reading out the strategies for 16 different types. But they're the kind of highlights there that I've just said. But absolutely would recommend people looking at that information and thinking, what does apply to you? How effective is that going to be for you? How do you want to engage in that? So there's some really interesting advice within the actual paper. I don't think there's anything else.
To link to it.
Good. I don't think there's anything else now. I think I'll probably do the very typical thing. I was going to say I'll do the very typical thing of ending this conversation and thinking, oh, I should have said that. So I don't think so at the moment that there's anything else that I'd add.
Okay. Well, I have loved having you on this podcast. So much good information.
Thank you.
And if you do think of anything, you are definitely welcome to come back and we can have a part 2 conversation about this. Maybe we just cover the whole research paper and then we can go into all the 16 types. Because I feel like if we do that, like that's a whole episode on its own. Like,
absolutely.
Individual 16 types well-being is its own episode.
Absolutely. Definitely.
But thank you so much, Melissa, for being on this episode. You shared so much amazing information. I really appreciate too all the references to the specific research that you shared and the statistics. I know that's something that a lot of people really like to hear, and it's very impactful too. So I'll make sure I link all the research and the CIDP. Oh, CIPD. There we go.
They've got some really great research. Definitely.
Yeah. We can dig into that. But thank you. And
thank you.
I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Melissa.